Welcome to WAHNcast, the podcast of the Women's Affordable Housing Network. I'm Angie Truitt, and I'm thrilled to have Christina Ott joining us for today's episode. Christina is the Chief Operating Officer at Rural Housing Developers, an organization dedicated to addressing the unique and pressing housing needs in rural communities. Welcome, Christina.
Hi, thank you for having me, Angie.
I know we talked about this before, and I love yours. Tell me about your walkout song and why you would choose it.
I think it would be Thunderstruck because I'm really short and people usually don't think a lot of me. And then I, try to hit, surprise them.
Good choice. So we're going to get right into talking about rural housing development. What are the unique challenges that you think rural communities face when it comes to affordable housing?
Well, I think it's, availability and affordability. So they're lower population density, so there's less units available for people to rent. And then to construct in rural areas, it's more costly. So that's why we focus on the preservation of existing housing. So we focus on rehabs mainly because it is really hard for a small rural project the numbers to work.
And I think that probably a lot of people until very recently associated affordable housing needs with densely populated urban areas, but obviously it's a problem everywhere, as we know, and specifically in rural areas. So how do you help identify and address housing needs in rural areas where you guys do your work?
Well, we're focusing on preservation. So we've partnered with existing owners on their aging stock. So we go out and outreach with other owners like ourselves and look for properties that need the rehabs. We usually either go ahead and try to acquire ownership now and then house them for tax credit rehabs later or partner with them on a rehab of their existing properties.
Would you like to share some of the recent projects that Rural Housing Developers has undertaken that highlight what your impact is?
So in the last 3 years, we have rehabilitated 780 rural units in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. So they're all smaller projects in smaller communities, Quinlan, Texas, Trinity, Texas, a lot of units in Belton, Texas. We've got Wagner, Oklahoma, Skytook, Oklahoma, Bourbon and Steelville, Missouri, but the total impact in the last 3 years has been 780 rehab units. So, and they're like new. We spend approximately $80,000 a unit and house about 1,850 rural units that either we have rehabbed recently or we plan to in the future.
What role does infrastructure like transportation, access to internet play in rural housing development?
Well, it's a big role. Obviously, when you're competitive in tax credits, that's something the agency is going to hand out points for, or you're going to get preference for your proximity to schools, grocery stores, transportation, especially in Texas, in what we call the at-risk category. If we aren't within about a mile from a school, we won't get our tax credit award.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's really challenging with some of the rural projects because obviously rural areas, people are a little further away and are driving and there's not as much transportation or obviously buses or different things like they have in the urban areas.
Absolutely. How do you approach partnerships with local governments and organizations to drive housing solutions?
Well, there's great grant programs that you can use to help with specific development costs. We also use a lot of rebates because we're putting new energy efficient equipment. So we're using a lot of energy rebates in our projects too, as we're replacing HVAC and systems in the properties.
For the industry as a whole, what lessons do you think that urban housing initiatives can learn from rural housing development efforts?
I think in the urban areas, which they are doing, I think preserving existing housing is important. They also, if I were developing in urban areas, I know it's not always sexy, but they could look at a smaller pocket projects, where you get in a suburb and do a smaller project that's still pretty urban if you're out in a suburb of Dallas, Flower Mound, or you're familiar with Dallas area and not in the area. So you could do a smaller 30-unit project there.
Is that something we've talked about this before? Kind of when you brought it up again, it made me recall an earlier conversation we had about the sexiness of a project. And I know that that's not a technical term, but do you think that there is some resistance within the industry to focus on those smaller projects or rural projects as opposed to, a bigger, flashier, sexier new development?
There's a lot of challenges in that way as far as like the investor wants more tax credits to invest in. So you have less tax credits, less units, less credits, less, money for the bank to loan. So you're not creating as big or it feels like less of an impact. So we have to do larger volumes. So I do think that has its challenges. 24 units is very challenging to get financing for just because they're like, well, this is smaller than what we normally invest in. We try to cobble sites together and make scattered sites deals. So we're adding, 24 units here to this, and then you have a 48 unit project or something like that. But some of these housing agencies have some constraints that don't allow us to combine, especially Missouri is very challenging in that way because there's 12 unit projects that USDA builds in Missouri or 8 units. And it's like, what are you going to do with that? We want to preserve it, but we're not going to get tax credits to do it. So you got to find creative ways to do so.
Right. It sounds like you've got to use creativity a lot, and not that the industry as a whole doesn't employ creativity, but generally when you're trying to, like you said, cobble together some scattered sites. And I know this is really timely, but HUD just announced quite a significant investment in rural housing. And I tried to kind of read up on it, didn't see a whole lot of detail before our call, but it's exciting to see that they are focusing on that and see the value in making that investment.
I think that's great because there is always a concern. There's always these rumors about HUD taking over USDA, which USDA is really heavy in the rural housing space. And then you've got, HUD's going to push everything into the urban areas, and then there won't be any affordable housing out in the rural areas. And then that pushes everybody into the cities, which obviously with my mission or our mission, that's not what I would like to see happen because we'd like to be able to stay in their smaller communities.
Right. And there's definitely value for that. And just how do we address that? How do we go to where people are and give them alternatives to what we're facing now, trying to drive the cost down for housing in general, but just providing different options rather than moving into the city where some might be available. What ways do you think rural housing development contributes to the larger affordable housing industry?
Well, we're satisfying demand for preserving stock in rural areas. The demand for multifamily housing has grown everywhere, including small communities. So we're trying to keep it where, as we already talked, rural, where people are. They don't have to move into the urban areas. So that's contributing to the larger stock. We've got units that were going to die if people weren't going to live in these places because they, frankly, were not a place anybody would want to live. So as we're preserving them and rehabbing them, they are a nice place that people are proud of, and they get to stay in their community and live there.
And I think it's interesting because I think all of us, when we think of rural communities, we think, well, housing's bound to be affordable. It's farther away from a city. It's farther away from most jobs, but there's probably a lot of places that people can still buy homes. I know in my little small town of Maple Hill, Kansas, I always watch when houses go for sale. It's 2 square miles, 18 miles west of Topeka. And I've been wanting to buy my grandparents' old house for a while. So I wait to see if a sign goes up in the yard. And I think we sold it at auction after my grandfather passed away for $18,000. And it was a little 2-story shotgun style house, very, very small. Recent owners did make some additions to it. But I think when it went on the market most recently, it was listed for like $180,000. And people can't afford that.
Right. I mean, you think we have a lot of families, but we also have a lot of senior properties. And these are people on fixed income or disability, and they can't afford it. And our USDA properties, because we do a lot of in the 515 space where we're assuming A properties, these are 30% annual median people and under. So they don't have anywhere else that they could go and rent. For some of their rents are $50. So
wow.
Got to preserve it's specifically these really low income rural USDA properties. They've built all over the country back in, I think the program started in the 70s where USDA built these rural apartments. And some of these people at these income levels, I don't know where they would live.
Yeah, that's what my next question was going to be. Where do people go if that ceases to exist and they can't afford to buy a home?
Right. I mean, we have rental assistance from USDA. So many of our tenants are paying very, very little rent. But, and then you have people who qualify to be in the building that are paying a market rent or an affordable rent. So I don't know where they would go with family, I guess. I don't have somebody on making, I don't know what a disability payment is, but let's say it's $1,000 a month. They definitely couldn't afford that $180,000 house. And market rent is, $1,000, right?
Right.
So let's say it's cheaper in a rural community, still not any cheaper than $800, 700.
Right.
And if you're in
Right.
$1,000 or $1,200 a month.
Yeah, and speaking specifically about the aging population, you do have a lot of situations where elderly people have lived in a home for forever. It's been paid off for forever, but because property taxes keep going up, and they can't afford to stay in their homes anymore. And so you've got a lot of people kind of aging out of homes that they've lived in forever or don't have anything to leave to their children because their children can't afford the property tax payments. And so it sounds like, yeah, demand is just going to continue to increase in rural areas like it is everywhere.
As we know, not just property taxes, but insurance is sky high. I mean, I don't know how they could afford the insurance.
Absolutely, which is a good segue to the next question. What policy changes would you advocate for to better support rural housing development?
Well, I think the state housing agencies need to set aside funds or tax credits incentives for rural housing projects, specifically for these projects. A lot of them do have a USDA set aside or a rural set aside, but it needs to be more. All the agencies are different in how they do it, but I think we should be competing in our own segment against like kind properties. Because if you get, let's just take Oklahoma, I have a small rural project in Skyatook versus a big project in Tulsa, and I'm competing for the same tax credits. That's hard for me to win them.
That makes sense. And so I know that they're kind of left to their own devices at the housing agency level. So you would recommend some sort of standard where there would be a percentage allocated specifically for rural development.
Right. And they can, whatever the state sees fit of what they define rural as, or how big the town has to be or not to be. Because some of our projects are really, and now these towns were rural and they're now suburbs of bigger cities. And so they're not really that rural anymore.
How can those in the affordable housing industry better amplify the voices and needs of rural communities?
I think better outreach, and we do this with conferences, but the investors and lenders kind of getting them to invest in these smaller projects. And I know they have the community investment. The banks are encouraged to do that. So that's a good place to start. But like I said, these smaller projects, we've got to find a way to get them motivated to be interested in giving their money or investing their money or loaning their money in those areas. I think that's just more of a talking to the lenders and investors at the conferences when we see them and making sure they're interested.
I know that there's been some recent movement, and I've seen, I know one helped facilitate a rural housing development conversation. I think it was hosted by our Atlanta chapter and our Alabama chapter earlier this year. And I know that there was a lot of interest in it. So hopefully we'll see, more things like that. And to the extent one can get involved in pushing that conversation forward, we certainly will. On to you a little bit. And I know when we first talked, I loved this story. I love hearing about people's connections to affordable housing because, as I'm sure you know, most people don't set out to go do this type of work when they're looking at their future career, but there's usually something that draws them in. So what inspired you to get involved in rural housing development?
So it's kind of a funny story. I was actually I worked a lot on the transactional side. I was a title company closer and a commercial title examiner, and I wound up actually working for a light tech company that also did a lot of solar transactions. So I was closing solar deals. And when I looked at moving to work for Doug and Ryan Hamilton at Rural Housing, I realized that when I was 19, I lived in one of their father's USDA 515 low-income units. I was a 19-year-old.
Oh, wow.
Family wasn't very happy with my choices. And I was lucky enough that that's where I got my start. I got a USDA 515 rental assisted unit. And I think my rent was like $5. And I was able to get daycare assistance and start going to school and started my path. So without that unit, I would not be where I'm sitting today.
That's incredible. Yeah, I can't imagine facing all of that as, a young person, 19 years old, and getting that kind of help is life-changing for real.
Right. Because the family, obviously when you get pregnant right out of high school, the family's not very happy with you. But the lady who does my hair had a similar experience. And now she owns her own hair salon in Springfield, Missouri, and had a similar experience. So I think not just for single mothers, but obviously for seniors, and there's people that need that little bit of help. And hopefully a lot of them take that little bit of a bridge and go somewhere with it. I know there's a lot of talk about how, that we're giving handouts, but I look at it more like a hand up, and a safe place for somebody to live is very important. Well, I believe in what we're doing.
Developed.
And I know Ryan and Doug Hamilton do. And of course, Ken was a pioneer in this space in the 70s. And before even tax credits came out in 86, he was working with USDA properties. So they came out first. And then Section 42 came about in 1986. And then he started using the tax credits in conjunction with the USDA and other properties. But to your point, especially in the new construction projects where you have a lot of people who are 60% annual median income and under, you are talking about a nurse, or you're talking about a teacher or a firefighter, or just the average person that you would meet in the street. I think a lot of people think of people who need affordable housing as being people who aren't worthy or they don't want it in their neighborhoods. And it's not necessarily the case.
Absolutely. And I think if we did the math for many of us today, many of us would probably qualify to be in affordable housing. How do you envision the future of rural housing development in the next 10 to 20 years?
Oh, I think we'll continue, hopefully, to keep rehabbing stock. I'm hoping we'll keep doing, a few hundred units a year, and keep growing and doing even more. I don't see us slowing down. I see us ramping up and continuing to try to do this where we can, because there are a lot of older properties that need help. We're even thinking about expanding into other states. So we would like to see more units be preserved.
Yeah, and I think there are plenty to preserve. What's been your most rewarding experience working at rural housing developers?
Well, last year we did a Christmas celebration at one of the properties we had done a rehab at. And so we went down, and Redstone Equity was our partner. So we went down to Trinity, Texas, and we had a Christmas or holiday lunch. And we were able to donate a big screen TV for the community room. Most of these properties have a community room or add a community room for the tenants, especially the senior properties, because they actually do get together, watch games or stuff together. And then we were able to give all the tenants a Christmas gift. But as rewarding as that was, when I sat down next to a tenant and I asked her how she liked her new apartment, and she said, "I liked it better before." Your property, but I always thought that was funny. I was like, "Well, we tried to make it nice for you."
That'd probably be something my dad would say. I could hear that. He just likes the things the way the things are. So if you change them. But I'm sure everything works a whole lot better, even if she didn't appreciate the new aesthetic.
It looks great. They're brand new. $80,000 a unit is our average spend. That's a brand new unit. So
wow. Well, hopefully she's enjoying the big screen TV at least, watching some of her programs.
Just happy, right?
What advice would you give to those who want to support or get involved in rural housing development?
I would either work for or partner with an existing developer. Anything in the LIHTC space, it's hard for somebody new. People get out of college and I'm going to go develop affordable housing. I think there's just so many existing people out there, and they already know the game. And I hate to say it, it is a game. They know how to get the awards, from the agencies. So there are point systems, but people have a lot of experience of figuring out how to get the tax credit awards. So either partner with them or go work for an existing developer or nonprofit and get your experience, and then you can wind up developing projects yourself. If you're in finance, go work for, an equity investor, or go work for a bank loaning in this space. Just find out if you want to be in affordable housing, find out who the players are and go work with them or work for them.
How do you balance the focus on rural housing needs while aligning with broader affordable housing goals?
We have a sister company, Trinity Housing Development, that is focused on new construction in urban areas. So we're kind of hand in hand as a team doing two different lanes. So we are working both kinds of projects.
Now, you mentioned we've talked about allocation of credits and some challenges that exist there. Are there some interesting challenges that you face with getting capital, not just for the very small jobs, but just in rural housing in general?
Well, your market studies are important and, you have to convince the investors that you're going to be able to lease up, right? So not only getting their money, but also convincing them that you're going to lease up. And a lot of times they hold capital back till you've proved that you're able to do so. The best thing about the rehabs is that you do have existing tenants, which is nice. So that's great, but it's also challenging because you have to move them. Don't have enough empty space, then your relocation costs go sky high.
Right.
And you've got a very small community with one hotel. So, it can be really hard. We've really had budgets be blown by relocation in rural areas because there's one hotel.
There's no place for them to go.
Right. Or you have to move them to the town next door and they're driving kids to school. I mean, we really are upheavaling tenants and we hate to do that, but it is in the rural areas that does make our deals a little more challenging.
I bet that would. So do you work in phases?
Yeah, that's typically what we do. Construction would like us to give them the whole project at once, but we like to move them, do 12 units and try to move those 12 tenants to other vacant units. But a lot of times in rural areas, our places,
there's no vacant.
There's no vacant. So we just had a property close and we still haven't moved the first phase because it was 100% occupied and there's no hotels. So we're trying to figure out, and they're seniors. So those things be very challenging is where do these people go? And a lot of them, unfortunately, don't have family they can go stay with. So that is an option for them where we'll give them a stipend to stay with family. But if they don't have family, we're finding a hotel room, which can be costly to us. And obviously, it's really hard to move the seniors. It's really upsetting to them.
For sure. What's the timeline typically that they're displaced?
Usually about 90 days. We try to go by that, but usually they're typically out 3 months. But it's ideal if we have other units on site. That's the best.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, I can't imagine my dad having to move somewhere else for 90 days. He wouldn't be happy. But as long as we could put on Wheel of Fortune, I think he would manage.
What's funny is like even in the family projects, they have these little sub-communities within these apartment complexes, especially the bigger ones. And they're like, I want to go back to the unit with the people, the area of the we're like, we can't guarantee you're going back to your unit. When we're all said and done, if they left unit 1, we just cannot guarantee they'll be back in unit.
They're coming back there. Well, it's good to show, though, that they are forming community where they are. As much of a struggle it might be to replace them into new units in different areas, it shows that they are, forming bonds and relationships with people within their community. So that's a plus.
I had a tenant call crying, wanting to go back because they are family. They have dinner together and they watch each other's kids, and it is a community.
Let's talk a little bit about sustainability. What role does that play in rural housing developments?
So we do, replace all mechanical, electrical, plumbing to new upgraded systems. I would like, since I come from the solar space, someday to be able to use the energy tax credit along with these projects and maybe put solar on the roofs. And I think at some point that's going to be a mandate by the housing agencies. But I do see it going that way in the future where we're adding some solar or some other energy efficient in addition to the new equipment, of course.
Right. So listeners to this WAHNcast episode, what can they do to help advance rural housing initiatives?
Well, advocate for government programs like USDA Rural Housing Service, HUD, support those people and what they're doing. Obviously, when somebody's coming into your community with housing, don't oppose, sometimes these neighborhood communities to get coalitions opposing people coming in, really think about, this NIMBYism or what, think about how is it really going to impact you? Teachers or nurses living in your community. We're lucky where we don't get as much opposition because the property's already there. So,
right.
So we're saying, hey, we're going to come back in and freshen it up. So we don't usually get opposition, but new construction projects get a lot of opposition, and support those projects because they're important to those communities, because you don't want to see all these smaller, like I live in a town of 6,000 people. We don't want that to die and people have to go move to Springfield, Missouri, where they don't want to live. They want to live here. So, support the smaller communities. And when you're out in those communities, eat there, support the businesses there, shop local, those kind of things help everybody.
So, podcast Are there any that you listen to regularly, other than WAHNcast, of course, that you would recommend? And it doesn't have to be on housing. It can be on anything.
I'm a big Mel Robbins fan. So
I love Mel too.
I know. And so great.
I get out of bed because of her 5-second rule. I used to be a horrible snoozer and then started watching her.
I think especially for women, and because we're talking to, yes, great podcasts about menopause or things, communicating with your kids, with your spouse, just overall a good message of caring about people and making your life better.
I think we can all use that. We don't have enough of those. So, well, Christina, is there anything else that I didn't ask that you want to communicate about, what you're doing, what rural housing developers are doing, anything going on in the industry in general we didn't touch on?
No, I appreciate you doing this. And I hope it gets more people inspired to get involved in rural housing or support the rural communities or go live in a rural community or a suburb where I know it's hard because urban people, it's not walkable. But there is a lot of good communities and people that you meet in the rural areas and support this initiative because it's very important. If your grandma lives in a small town, I know nobody wants grandma having to move to Tulsa or Oklahoma City or Dallas, so support us in what we're doing and remember that it's good for housing affordability to be everywhere.
I agree. And I think everybody agrees it's such a multifaceted problem.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think everybody in the United States wants to move into a big city.
I think that's a fair statement. A lot of people will be happy to visit, but want to go back home. And home needs to be there for them, to go back home too. So, well, thank you for everything that you guys do and the Hamiltons do, and for being pioneers in the area before tax credits were even tax credits. So you guys have made an impact and continue to do so. So thank you very much and appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Angie. I appreciate being on. I enjoyed it.